Alright, so we're going to wrap up our Period 3 review now by looking at Key Concept 3.3 that states migration within North America and competition over resources, boundaries, and trade intensified conflicts among peoples and nations. That's a lot of stuff going on in there in 3.3. So what I thought we would start with is by looking at some foreign issues. And when the Treaty of Paris was signed, the British gave basically the American colonists all their land out to the Mississippi River, so all that became American territory. However, the British very provocatively maintained forts on American soil, particularly in the upper Mississippi area, up near the Great Lakes and so forth. And they would also supply Native Americans with weapons that of course would be used against Americans. So the British are really trying to provoke, and the Spanish are doing this as well, we'll come back to that later. They're trying to provoke the Native Americans into rebellions, into wars that will distract and weaken and sort of grind down the Americans. Another very provocative act from the British side would be impressment. Recall that the British would stop American ships on the high seas, and they would accuse these Americans of being basically runaway British sailors, and they would basically kidnap them back into British service. And so we have the British really, even though they've given us our independence, they're not treating us as an equal, as a full-fledged independent nation. They're very much looking down on us and provoking us. The British aren't the only problem. The British and the French are going to go to war as a consequence of the wars, the French Revolution, and ultimately Napoleon will come out of all that. And the U.S. finds itself caught in between those two big powers. We wanted to maintain our neutrality. We wanted to trade with all nations of the world, both the British and the French. And the French didn't want us trading with the British didn't want us trading with the French, and we find ourselves basically on the high seas getting stopped and seized by both British and French ships. Now on the French side, we call this the quasi-war, and this is kind of an unofficial naval war we're fighting with the French on the open seas. Now, which, of course, the great irony in all of that is we were still technically allies with the French, if you recall. The French had come in and helped us in the American Revolution. We were still allies, but here we are on the high seas shooting at each other, and hysteria breaks out. War hysteria breaks out in America. That war with the French is on the horizon. In an attempt to soothe those tensions with the French, America is going to send some diplomats over to France, and they're going to be expected to pay bribes just to meet with the French foreign minister. We call this the XYZ affair, which is in 1797. Americans refuse to pay the bribe. They come home in a huff, and those war tensions continue to rise. Now, there's a political component to all this. The Federalists tended to be more pro-British and anti-French. Their political rivals, the Democratic Republicans, tended to be more pro-French and anti-British. And so in this potential war against France, the Federalists are going to really perhaps exaggerate the threat from the French and exaggerate the threat the French had specifically to Americans as a whole. And so the Federalists are going to use this potential war with France as a convenient excuse to pass some laws called the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now, in theory, these laws would protect Americans, but in reality, what they really were was a political hammer to use against their Democratic Republican political rivals. Now, at the same time, we're dealing with potential war against the British and the French. We also have, of course, conflicts on the frontier. So there are rebellions that are breaking out, such as Little Turtle's Rebellion. And in the end of all this, after the Battle of Fallen Timbers up here, where the Indians were finally defeated decisively, the Native Americans signed an agreement called the Treaty of Greenville, referring to Fort Greenville. And this would basically give everything in green to the Americans. Basically, the Indians would cede this land. They wouldn't try to defend it any longer. Now, of course, the Americans already feel as if we own all this anyways, because we were given this to us by the British in the Treaty of Paris. But the Native Americans don't feel that way. They wanted Americans to stay out of their lands. And the idea of huge sections being signed over in treaty form is obviously a precedent we're going to follow for basically the next century in our study of American history. A couple political precedents we could throw out there as we begin the new republic. George Washington, of course, was our first president, but he was also the first to create a cabinet. A cabinet is just simply a bunch of advisors, because as president, you can't know everything about everything, and so you need people who are experts in their area to help to give you good advice. You know, we should be doing this or should not be doing this, that sort of thing, and presidents have relied heavily on their cabinet ever since. It's interesting, the cabinet is not mentioned in the Constitution anywhere. This is a Washington basically creation, and it's something that every president since has made use of. Now, I was talking earlier about this political rivalry in the context of the quasi-war with France, and the Federalists were the party that was most pro-British and anti-French, and they were headed up, at least kind of behind the scenes anyways, or maybe not behind the scenes, maybe very clearly, by Alexander Hamilton, which will be our first Secretary of the Treasury. And the Democratic Republicans, who had grown out of the anti-Federalist tradition, was led by this guy, Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. Now, speaking of Hamilton, as first Secretary of the Treasury, he has to do something to get our economy sort of going. And he comes with this idea of basically two birds with one stone. He was a very strong proponent and a strong national government. He's always very skeptical of the states. And so his economic plans will not only strengthen the American economy, but also strengthen the national government at the same time. And his goal was to assume the debt of the states. See it here on our diagram. That means take them over, and then also add on all the debt the federal government already had, and to agree to pay these off at face value or on par. And to pursue this debt paying off situation, we're going to have a series of taxes and tariffs established to create revenue for the government, and to oversee all this interplay of money and so forth. Hamilton's great idea was the Bank of the United States, modeled on the Bank of England, having kind of one national bank. Now, the fight over the bank was a bitter one between Hamilton and Jefferson. It's a fight we're going to continue to explore with Andrew Jackson later, so it's not going away anytime soon, but it was a major issue you want to look back on, the Bank of the United States. So that is basically it for period 3. We've looked at everything from the start, the road to the American Revolution, to how the American Revolution changed our views on government, all the way up to some foreign issues we have to deal with after the war, also some major political precedents. Period 3 is a very important period. I could definitely see something about those early days of the American Republic on the DBQ. Certainly possible.